The iron shackles bit into Cordelia's wrists as rough hands shoved her onto the makeshift auction block behind Bramblewood's only saloon. Her emerald dress, once her mother's finest, now hung in tatters from 3 days of brutal captivity. Jeering crowd of drunken men pressed closer, their lewd comments making her stomach churn with revulsion. "What am I bid for this fine piece of merchandise?" bellowed Silas Ravencroft, the notorious slave trader who'd murdered her father and seized their homestead, fresh from the Eastern Territories, untouched and ready for breaking. Cordelia lifted her chin defiantly, despite the terror coursing through her veins. She would not give these animals the satisfaction of seeing her break, not when her father's blood still stained the porch where he died defending their farm. $50, shouted a gap-toothed miner. 75, countered a wealthy rancher with cruel eyes. The bidding escalated rapidly as Cordelia fought back tears. This couldn't be how her story ended, sold like cattle to the highest bidder in this godforsaken frontier town. She thought of her father's last words. "Stay strong, little wildflower. Help will come." The crowd suddenly fell silent as heavy footfalls echoed across the dusty ground. Sheriff Dashiell Ironwood emerged from the shadows, his silver badge gleaming. In the torchlight, at 6'4" with shoulders broad as an oak tree, he commanded respect wherever he walked. His steel-gray eyes swept over the assembled men with barely contained fury. "This gathering is illegal," Dashiell announced, his deep voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Slavery was abolished, gentlemen, or did you all conveniently forget that fact?" Ravencroft sneered, revealing rotted teeth. "She's an indentured servant, Sheriff. Signed papers and everything. Her daddy owed me money before he met his unfortunate end. Those papers are forgeries, and we both know it." Dashiell's hand rested casually on his Colt .45. "Release the woman immediately." "Or what?" Ravencroft pulled out a rusty blade, pressing it against Cordelia's throat. "You're outnumbered 20-1, lawman. Walk away and nobody gets hurt." Cordelia felt the cold steel against her skin and closed her eyes, praying to whatever gods might be listening. H.E.O. wasn't them again. Dashiell was staring directly at her with an intensity that stole her breath. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection deeper than words could express. "Last warning, Ravencroft." The sheriff's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Let her go." The blade pressed deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. "Make me." What happened next would be talked about in Bramblewood saloons for decades to come. Dashiell's gun cleared leather faster than lightning strikes, the thunder of gunshots splitting the night air. Ravencroft's blade clattered to the ground as he clutched his wounded hand, screaming in agony. The other men scattered like startled rabbits, abandoning their auction and their courage in equal measure. Within seconds, Dashiell had climbed onto the platform and was carefully removing Cordelia's shackles with hands, surprisingly gentle for their size. When their fingers touched, she felt electricity shoot through her entire body. "You're safe now," he murmured, his eyes never leaving hers. "I give you my word. No harm will come to you while I draw breath." Cordelia found herself drowning in those storm-gray depths, her heart hammering against her ribs for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The sheriff's modest cabin sat on the outskirts of Bramblewood, surrounded by towering pines and wild lavender that perfumed the cool night air. Dashiell had insisted on bringing Cordelia here rather than the town's boarding house, claiming it wasn't safe with Ravencroft's men still lurking about. She suspected there was more to his protectiveness than mere duty. "I'll take the floor," he announced gruffly, setting down a basin of warm water and clean cloths. "You need proper rest and medical attention." Cordelia winced as she tried to remove her ruined dress, the fabric catching on her numerous cuts and bruises. Without hesitation, Dashiell stepped forward, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped ease the garment over her shoulders. She should have felt embarrassed standing before him in only her chemise, but instead, she felt cherished, protected. "Who did this to you?" His voice was deadly quiet as he examined the rope burns on her wrists and the bruises mottling her fair skin. "Ravencroft and his animals," she whispered, flinching as he cleaned a particularly deep cut on her shoulder. "They killed my father when he refused to sign over our land, said they'd make me pay his debts on my back." Dashiell's jaw clenched. so hard she could hear his teeth grinding. "That bastard won't touch you again. I'll see him hang for what he's done." As he tended her wounds with infinite care, Cordelia found herself studying his rugged features in the lamplight. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and weathered lines around his eyes spoke of too many years fighting other men's battles. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, reminder that even the law wasn't always enough to protect the innocent. "Why did you become a sheriff?" she asked softly, his hands stilled on the bandage he was wrapping around her wrist. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with old pain. "Lost my younger sister to men like Ravencroft when I was 19. Slavers took her during a raid on our settlement. I spent 3 years tracking them, but ... double quotes. He shook his head. "I was too late. Found her grave marker in a cemetery outside Santa Fe. She was 16 when they killed her." Cordelia's heart broke for this strong man carrying such devastating grief. Without thinking, she reached up and touched the scar on his face. He flinched at first, then leaned into her caress like a man starved for gentle human contact. "Sorry," she whispered. "What was her name?" "Magnolia?" She loved flowers. Always picked wildflowers for our mother's table. His eyes found hers. "I swore on her grave that I'd never let another innocent woman suffer what she did. That's why I pinned on this badge." They sat in comfortable silence as he finished bandaging her wounds, the crackle of the fireplace and gentle night sounds creating an intimate cocoon around them. When he was done, Dashiell started to rise, but Cordelia caught his hand.
"Out."
"Go," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Please, I ... I don't want to be alone tonight." He studied her face for a long moment, then settled back beside her on the narrow bed. "I'll stay until you fall asleep." But as the hours passed, neither of them slept. They talked instead about her life back east, her dreams of becoming a teacher, his lonely years keeping the peace in various frontier towns. She learned that he read poetry in his spare time and played guitar, though he claimed to be terrible at it. He discovered that she could speak 3 languages and had once punched a boy for pulling her pig tails. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Cordelia found her head resting on Dashiell's broad chest, his strong arms wrapped protectively around her. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly safe. "Cordelia," he murmured. "Against her hair? When this is over, when Ravencroft is behind Barswood, you consider staying in Bramblewood? The town needs a schoolteacher, and I need you." She lifted her head to meet his gaze, seeing vulnerability in those steel-gray eyes that took her breath away. "I'm not going anywhere, Dashiell Ironwood." 3 days later, Cordelia stood before the cracked mirror in Bramblewood's general store. Hardly recognizing the woman staring back at her, gone was the terrified victim from the auction block. In her place stood someone stronger, fiercer, someone who'd found her purpose in the most unlikely of places. "You sure about this?" asked Evangeline Blackthorne, the store owner who'd become Cordelia's first friend in town. The elderly woman's weathered hands adjusted the holster around Cordelia's waist with practiced ease. "Learning to shoot is one thing, but going after Rond, too." "He murdered my father," Cordelia replied, checking the cylinder of the Colt. 38 Dashiell had taught her to use. "I won't cower in that cabin while he continues terrorizing innocent people." The past few days had been a whirlwind of stolen moments and growing attraction. Dashiell would return from his patrols dusty and exhausted, but his eyes would light up the moment he saw her. They'd share quiet dinners by the fireplace, their conversations growing deeper, more intimate. Last night, he'd finally kissed her. Under the stars, and Cordelia had felt her world shift on its axis. But with love came the fierce need to protect what mattered most. "Ravencroft's been recruiting more men," Evangeline warned. "Word is, he's planning something big." The sheriff spread thin, trying to keep watch on all his holdings. That was exactly what Cordelia had feared. Dashiell was one man against an army, and his sense of honor would never allow him to back down. She'd already lost her father to Ravencroft's greed. She wouldn't lose the man she loved as well. The bell above the store's door chimed, and Cordelia tensed, hand moving instinctively to her weapon. But it was only young Timothy Ashworth, the telegraph operator, his face flushed from running. "Miss Cordelia, Sheriff Ironwood needs you at the jailhouse quick as you can." Her blood ran cold. "What's happened?" Ravencroft's made his move. "Took over the Crimson Rose Saloon with a dozen armed men. Says he wants to parley with the sheriff, but only if you're there as insurance." Cordelia was already moving toward the door. "Tell Dashiell I'm coming, miss." "Wait." Timothy caught her arm. "The sheriff said to tell you specifically not to come. Said he'd handle it himself. Of course he had. The stubborn, noble fool would rather die than put her in danger, which was exactly why she had to act. The jailhouse was in chaos when she arrived, with half the town crowded outside arguing about what should be done. She pushed through the crowd and found Dashiell loading rifles with grim determination, his deputies flanking him nervously. "Absolutely not," he said, without looking up when she entered. "Don't even think about it, Cordelia." "Think about what?" she asked innocently, though her hand rested on her pistol grip. "Whatever reckless plan is forming in that brilliant mind of yours." He finally met her eyes, and she saw the fear, there not for himself, but for her. "Ravencroft wants you there because he knows you're my weakness. I won't give him that kind of power." "Your weakness?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice so the deputies couldn't hear. "Dashiell, you're the strongest man I've ever known. But strength isn't about facing everything alone. It's about knowing when to trust the people who love you." His composure cracked at the word love. And for a moment she saw past the sheriff's badge to the man underneath, only scared, carrying the weight of everyone's safety on his shoulders. "I can't lose you," he whispered roughly. "Not when I've just found you. Then don't." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Trust me to be your partner in this, not just someone you need to protect. I'm not helpless anymore, and I'm certainly not defenseless." Before he could protest, she drew her weapon in one smooth motion, spinning it expertly around her finger before holstering it again. His eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Evangeline taught me a few tricks your lessons didn't cover," she said with a small smile. "Now, what's the plan?" For a long moment, Dashiell stared at her, torn between his protective instincts and his growing respect for her courage. Finally he sighed and pulled out a rough map of the saloon. "If we're doing this, we do it right." And Cordelia, his eyes burned into hers. "You follow my lead no matter what happens. Promise me." She nodded solemnly. "I promise." Neither of them mentioned that promises made in desperate times were often the hardest ones to keep. The Crimson Rose Saloon buzzed with tension as thick as the cigarette smoke hanging in the stale air. Ravencroft had positioned his men strategically to guarding the front entrance. 3 more at the windows and the rest scattered throughout the main room where terrified patrons huddled in corners. The man himself sat at the poker table like a king holding court, his scarred face twisted in a satisfied grin. Cordelia entered first, her hands raised but her spine straight as a steel rod. Every eye in the place turned to her, and she felt their hungry gazes like spiders crawling across her skin. But she kept her focus on Ravencroft, channeling every ounce of hatred into steady resolve. Well, Ravencroft drawled, gesturing for her to approach. "If it isn't the little wildflower who's been causing me so much trouble, you look ... different. Less broken." "You murdered my father," she stated simply, stopping just out of arm's reach. "Want to hear you admit it." His laughter was like broken glass. Jeremiah Whitmore was a stubborn fool who wouldn't listen to reason. He brought his fate on himself. Behind him, Dashiell slipped through the saloon's back entrance, moving with the silent grace of a predator. Their plan was simple. Cordelia would keep Ravencroft distracted, while Dashiell positioned himself for a clear shot. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. "You know what I find fascinating?" Ravencroft continued, leaning back in his chair. "How quickly our noble sheriff developed feelings for damaged goods. It must be lonely out there in that cabin, playing house with a woman who's seen too much." Cordelia's hand twitched toward her concealed weapon, but she forced herself to remain still. At least he's man enough to protect what he loves, instead of preying on the defenseless. Protect. Ravencroft's eyes glittered with malice. "Is that what you call it when he lets you walk into a trap?" The words hit her like ice water. Behind Ravencroft, she caught a glimpse of movement, but it wasn't Dashiell, more armed. Men emerged from the shadows. Weapons trained on the spot where the sheriff should be. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the horrible truth became clear. Somehow, Ravencroft had anticipated their plan, which meant Dashiell was walking into an ambush, and she was the bait. Ravencroft stood slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "I've been in this business too long to fall for such amateur tactics. Your boyfriend should arrive, right about now." The front doors burst open as Dashiell charged in, both pistols drawn. But instead of catching the outlaws off guard, he found himself facing a dozen gun barrels pointed in his direction. His eyes met Cordelia's across the smoky room, and she saw his heart break as he realized what had happened. "Drop your weapons, Sheriff," Ravencroft commanded, "or watch your pretty little dove take a bullet." For one terrible moment, time seemed suspended. Cordelia could see Dashiell calculating odds, looking for angles, trying to find a way to save them both. But they were outnumbered 6-1, with innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. His guns hit the floor with metallic clangs that echoed like funeral bells. "Excellent." Ravencroft smiled like a satisfied cat. "Now kick them away." Complied, Cordelia made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. With lightning speed, she drew her concealed pistol and pressed the barrel against her own temple. The entire room froze. "Let him go," she said calmly, meeting Ravencroft's shocked gaze. "You want me alive? That's the whole point of this charade. But if you harm one hair on his head, I'll paint these walls with my brains and you'll have nothing." "Cordelia!" "No." Dashiell's anguished cry cut through her like a blade. "Clever girl," Ravencroft mused, though his confidence had slipped several notches. "But you're forgetting something important. I don't just want you a Livy. I want you broken, and watching your lover die slowly will accomplish that beautifully." He nodded to his men, who began advancing on Dashiell with cruel smiles. Cordelia's finger tightened on the trigger, her mind racing through increasingly desperate options. That's when the first window exploded inward in a shower of glass and gunfire, followed immediately by the second and third. Evangeline Blackthorne and the town's other shopkeepers poured through the openings like avenging angels, weapons blazing and war cries echoing off the walls. In the chaos that followed, Cordelia dove for cover behind an overturned table as bullets flew like deadly rain. She'd underestimated the people of Bramblewood. They might be simple folk, but they protected their own, and somehow, against all odds, they were about to give her and Dashiell a fighting chance. Gunfire erupted throughout the Crimson Rose as the townspeople of Bramblewood proved they weren't as helpless as Ravencroft had assumed. Evangeline Blackthorne moved through the chaos like a woman half her age, her twin revolvers speaking with deadly accuracy. Dr. Mortimer Caldwell, the mild-mannered physician, had transformed into a fierce warrior, protecting his patients and neighbors. Cordelia rolled behind the bar as splinters exploded from the wood above her head. Through the smoke and confusion, she spotted Dashiell diving for his fallen weapons, 3 of Ravencroft's men converging on his position. Without hesitation, she rose from cover and put 2 bullets center mass into the nearest outlaw. Her father's hunting lessons serving her well, even in this hellish environment. "Behind you," she screamed to Dashiell, as another gunman rounded the corner. The sheriff spun and fired in one fluid motion, his shot taking the man down before he could pull his trigger. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and despite the chaos surrounding them, Cordelia felt that familiar spark of connection. They were partners now, in every sense of the word. But Ravencroft had vanished in the confusion, and that terrified her more than all his visible men combined. The back room. Evangeline shouted over the gunfire, reloading with practiced efficiency. "He's making for the back room." Cordelia knew what lay beyond that doorstairs leading to the saloon's upper floor. And from there, access to the roof and multiple escape routes. If Ravencroft reached high ground, he could pick them off one by one, while his remaining men held them pinned down. She made another split-second decision that would have given Dashiell nightmares if he'd known. Instead of seeking cover, She sprinted directly through the crossfire toward the rear of the building, ignoring the bullets whining past her ears and the splinters of wood exploding around her feet. Cordelia. The Dashiell's roar of anguish followed her, but she couldn't stop now. She hit the back room door at full speed, her shoulder connecting with the wood so hard that pain shot down her entire arm. The door burst open to reveal Ravencroft halfway up the narrow staircase, his face twisted with rage at being pursued by a mere woman. "You should have stayed hidden, little dove," he snarled, raising his pistol. Cordelia threw herself sideways. As his shot splintered the door frame where her head had been, she rolled, came up firing, and put a bullet through his thigh that sent him tumbling back down the stairs with a scream of pain and fury. But wounded animals were often the most dangerous, and Ravencroft proved that axiom true. Even with blood streaming down his leg, he moved with vicious speed, knocking her gun from her hand and wrapping his fingers around her throat before she could react. "I'm going to enjoy breaking you," he hissed, his grip tightening until stars danced before her eyes. "Slowly, thoroughly, and your precious sheriff will watch every minute of it before I put a bullet in his brain." Cordelia clawed at his hands, fighting for air that wouldn't come. Her vision began to darken around the edges, and she could feel her strength ebbing away. But just as unconsciousness beckoned, her fingers found the small derringer she'd hidden in her boot. Evangeline's parting gift that morning with the last of her strength. She pressed the tiny barrel against Ravencroft's ribs and pulled the trigger. The small caliber bullet wasn't enough to kill him, but the surprise and pain loosened his grip enough for her to break free. She gasped desperately for air, her throat feeling like it had been crushed by an iron fist. Ravencroft staggered backward, one hand pressed to his bleeding side, his face a mask of murderous intent. "Bitch," he wheezed. "I'll make you pay for that." "No," said a familiar voice from the doorway, cold as winter steel. "You won't." Dashiell stood in the entrance like an avenging angel, his smoking pistol trained on Ravencroft's heart. His gray eyes held no mercy, no hesitation, only the absolute certainty of justice about to be served. "This is for Jeremiah Whitmore," he said quietly, "and for every other innocent life you've destroyed." The gunshot echoed through the small room like thunder. Ravencroft's eyes widened in shock before the light faded from them forever. He collapsed to the floor. His reign of terror finally ended. The sudden silence was deafening after the prolonged gunfight. From the main room came the sounds of surrender, Ravencroft's remaining men throwing down their weapons as the townspeople emerged. Victorious, Dashiell holstered his weapon and crossed to Cordelia in 3 quick strides, his hands gentle as he examined her bruised throat and the various cuts she'd sustained. "Are you hurt, Diddy?" "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice was hoarse from near strangulation. "Is it over?" "It's over." He pulled her against his chest, and she could feel his heart hammering beneath her cheek. "God, Cordelia, when I saw you run into that crossfire, I thought I'd lost you." "Never," she managed, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You'll never lose me, Dashiell. Ironwood, I promise." This time, it was a promise she intended to keep. 2 weeks after the gunfight at the Crimson Rose, Bramblewood had settled into a peaceful routine that felt almost surreal after months of living under Ravencroft's shadow. The outlaw's surviving men had been shipped off to the territorial prison, his ill-gotten assets distributed among his victims' families, and the town was finally free to prosper without fear. Cordelia stood in the doorway of what would soon become Bramblewood's first proper schoolhouse, watching Dashiell and the other men raise the building's frame against the backdrop of autumn-painted mountains. The sight of him working in the golden afternoon sunlight, his shirt sleeves rolled up and sweat glistening on his muscled forearms, never failed to make her pulse quicken. Admiring the view, Evangeline appeared beside her with a knowing smile, carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread for the workers. Perhaps, Cordelia admitted, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "It's remarkable how quickly the town has come together to build this. Folks are grateful for what you and the sheriff did." Besides, the older woman's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Everyone knows a proper teacher needs a proper schoolhouse. Can't have you conducting lessons in the back room of my store forever." The past 2 weeks had been the happiest of Cordelia's life. Despite sleeping in Evangeline's cramped quarters above the general store, Each morning, she'd teach the handful of local children their letters and numbers. Each evening, she'd share dinner with Dashiell, their conversations growing deeper and more intimate as they discovered the thousand small things that made them compatible. He'd read her poetry by lamplight, his deep voice bringing Walt Whitman's words to vivid life. She'd taught him phrases in French and Italian, laughing at his earnest attempts at pronunciation. They'd walk together under star-filled skies, talking about their dreams for Bramblewood's future and the growing certainty that their own futures were inextricably intertwined. But something was troubling him today. She'd noticed it in the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes. The tension in his shoulders that had nothing to do with physical labor. Cordelia. Dr. Caldwell approached, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Might I have a word?" She followed him away from the construction site, noting how his usually cheerful demeanor had turned serious. "Is something wrong, doctor?" "Not wrong, exactly. Concerning, perhaps." He pulled an official-looking envelope from his coat pocket. "This arrived on today's stage. It's addressed to you, sent from the territorial capital." Cordelia's blood ran, cold as she recognized the government seal. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax and unfolded the letter. Her worst fears confirmed as she read the formal language. The territorial government had received reports of her father's death and the disputed ownership of the Whitmore homestead. As his sole heir, she was required to appear before a probate judge within 30 days to establish legal claim to the property. Failure to appear would result in the land being declared abandoned and available for public auction. "I have to go back," she whispered, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "They'll take everything if I don't." "Not necessarily," Dr. Caldwell said gently. "Sheriff Ironwood has been consulting with the territorial attorney. There may be other options." But Cordelia barely heard him. All she could think about was leaving Bramblewood, leaving Dashiell, returning to the place where her father had died to fight a legal battle she might well lose. The homestead held everything her family had built over 2 generations. She couldn't simply abandon it, no matter how much her heart belonged to this dusty frontier town. That evening, she found Dashiell sitting on his cabin's front porch, staring out at the mountains with the same troubled expression she'd noticed earlier. He looked up as she approached, and she saw her own anguish reflected in his gray eyes. "You know about the letter," she said quietly, settling beside him on the wooden steps. "Doc Caldwell told me." His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the pain beneath the surface. "When will you leave?" "Tomorrow morning stage." The words came out steadier than she felt. "Dashiell, you don't need to explain." He reached for her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "That land is your birthright, your father's legacy. I understand why you have to fight for it." "Do you?" She turned to face him fully, memorizing every line of his beloved face in the fading light. "Because I'm not sure I understand it myself. That homestead represents everything I've lost, but Bramblewood represents everything I've found." His control finally cracked, and she saw the depth of his love and fear in his unguarded expression. "Come with me," she whispered impulsively. "Help me fight this battle, then we'll decide together where our future lies." For a moment, hope blazed in his eyes. Then reality crashed back down, and he shook his head sadly. "I can't abandon my responsibilities. Here, these people depend on me, and after what happened with our VNCROFT... I know." She cupped his face in her hands, feeling tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes. "I know, and I love you more for it." They held each other as darkness fell around them, both knowing that tomorrow might change everything, and neither willing to speak the fears that haunted their hearts. The courtroom in the territorial capital reeked of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies, its wooden benches packed with land speculators and legal vultures hoping to profit from disputed homesteads. Cordelia sat rigidly beside her court-appointed attorney, a nervous young man named Fitzpatrick, who seemed more interested in his pocket watch than her case. 3 days of testimony had painted a grim picture. Silas Ravencroft might be dead, but his forged documents and false witnesses had created a legal tangle that threatened to cost her everything. The judge, a stern man with calculating eyes, seemed inclined to believe that her father had indeed signed over the property as payment for gambling debts. "Your Honor," Fitzpatrick stammered, rising to present their final argument. "Client cannot produce the original deed. Lost, regrettably. In the fire that claimed the homestead's main house, we maintain that these alleged debts are fabrications designed to steal legitimate property from a grieving daughter." Judge Morrison looked unimpressed. "Can you prove these allegations, counselor? Or do you expect this court to take your word against documented evidence?" Cordelia's heart sank as Fitzpatrick fumbled with his papers, clearly out of his depth. She'd traveled 800 miles and spent her last dollars on legal fees, only to watch her father's life work slip away because of one man's greed and corruption. "Actually, Your Honor, I believe I can provide that proof." Every head in the courtroom turned toward the familiar voice. Cordelia's breath caught as Dashiell Ironwood strode down the center aisle, sheriff's badge glinting in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the tall windows. Behind him walked Dr. Caldwell, Evangeline Blackthorne, and a dozen other Bramblewood residents, their faces set with determination. "Sheriff Ironwood," Judge Morrison acknowledged with surprise, "this is highly irregular. You have no standing. In this proceeding, with respect, Your Honor, I disagree." Dashiell reached the plaintiff's table and placed a leather satchel beside Cordelia's trembling hands. "I've been investigating Silas Ravencroft's criminal activities for the past month. What I found may interest this court considerably." He opened the satchel and withdrew a stack of documents, his movements confident and precise. Ravencroft kept meticulous records of his forgeries and extortion schemes, bank records showing payments to judges and clerks, correspondence detailing his plans to acquire the Whitmore property through fraudulent means. And most importantly, Dashiell held up a single sheet of paper with a flourish. The original unaltered deed to the Whitmore homestead, bearing Jeremiah Whitmore's true signature and the territorial seal. Ravencroft kept it as insurance, never expecting his own records to be used against him. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of amazement and outrage. Judge Morrison examined the documents with growing astonishment, his stern expression gradually giving way to something approaching respect. "These are ... extraordinary revelations, Sheriff. How did you come by Ravencroft's? Private papers? Legal search and seizure of a known criminal's effects?" Dashiell replied smoothly. "All properly documented and witnessed." He gestured to Dr. Caldwell, who stepped forward with an official-looking folder. "Everything was inventoried according to territorial law," the doctor confirmed. "Sheriff Ironwood has been thorough in his investigation." Cordelia stared at the man she loved, hardly daring to believe what was happening. He'd abandoned his post, traveled 800 miles, and spent weeks gathering evidence, all to save her inheritance and prove her father's innocence. Furthermore, Evangeline spoke up from the gallery, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "We've taken the liberty of documenting every crime Ravencroft committed in our county. Murder, kidnapping, attempted human trafficking, extortion, the list goes on for pages." Judge Morrison studied the evidence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he set down the papers and fixed Cordelia with a measured look. "Miss Whitmore, based on this new evidence, I find that the claims against your father's estate were fraudulent. The original deed stands, and you are the rightful owner of the Whitmore homestead." His gavel fell with a sound like thunder. Case dismissed. The courtroom exploded in cheers from the Bramblewood delegation, while the land speculators filed out in disgust. But Cordelia only had eyes for Dashiell, who was watching her with an expression of such love and tenderness that it stole her breath. "Away you came," she whispered, as he pulled her into his arms, not caring who saw or what they thought. "I told you once that I'd never let another innocent woman suffer if I could prevent it," he murmured against her hair. "But the truth is, I came because I couldn't live without you. Bramblewood, the homestead, anywhere else none of it matters, as long as we're together." "Then marry me," she said impulsively, pulling back to meet his startled gaze. "Right here. Right now, Dr. Caldwell can perform the ceremony, and we'll have plenty of witnesses." Dashiell's answering smile was brighter than the sun streaming through the courthouse windows. "Cordelia Whitmore, nothing would make me happier." As their friends and neighbors gathered around them with tears and laughter, as Dr. Caldwell produced a worn Bible from his medical bag and cleared his throat officiously. Cordelia felt the broken pieces of her world finally clicking back into place. "Dearly beloved," the good doctor began, his voice carrying the weight of joy and solemnity. "We are gathered here in this most unusual of circumstances to witness the union of two souls who have found each other against all odds." Dashiell took her hands in his calloused fingers intertwining with hers as naturally as breathing. The courthouse had transformed around them, no longer a place of legal battles and bitter disputes, but a sacred space where love conquered all obstacles. "Do you, Dashiell Ironwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," he said simply, but his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "With all my heart, for all my days." "And do you, Cordelia Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, through whatever trials and triumphs await you, forsaking all others as long as you both shall live?" Cordelia looked into Dashiell's storm-gray eyes and saw their entire future reflected, their children playing in fields of wildflowers, quiet evenings on the cabin porch, growing old together under endless prairie skies. "I do," she whispered, then louder, "I do. Then, by the power vested in me by the territory and witnessed by these good people, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Sheriff, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was soft and tender, full of promise and hope, while their makeshift congregation erupted in cheers that echoed off the courthouse walls. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing through tears of pure joy. "So," Dashiell murmured, resting his forehead against hers, "Mrs. Ironwood, what do you say we go home?" "Which home?" she asked with a smile, knowing the answer didn't really matter. "Wherever you are," he replied, sealing his words with another kiss. 6 months later, combined Whitmore and Wood Ranch stretched across some of the most beautiful land in the territory. The original homestead had been rebuilt and expanded, the wraparound porch perfect for watching sunsets, and a garden where Cordelia grew the wildflowers that reminded Dashiell of his beloved sister. The schoolhouse in Bramblewood thrived under her guidance 3 days a week, while Dashiell continued serving as sheriff with a deputy to help manage his expanded territory. Their evenings were spent planning for the future, discussing the cattle they'd raise, children they hoped to have, the legacy they'd build together. On their 6-month anniversary, they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Cordelia placed Dashiell's hand on her still flat belly and smiled at his sharp intake of breath. "Really?" he whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. "Really?" she confirmed, laughing as he swept her into his arms and spun her around until they were both dizzy with happiness. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, as their love grew deeper with each passing day, Cordelia often thought about that terrible night when she'd stood shackled on an auction block, certain her story was ending. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything, the moment she'd met the man who would save her, love her, and build a beautiful life alongside her under the endless western sky. Sheriff Dashiell Ironwood had rescued her from being sold. In truth, they had rescued each other, finding in their love a home more precious than any land deed could ever convey.